Ms. Parke has been a significant force in human rights, international law, and humanitarian advocacy. Her journey is one of profound commitment to justice and equity. Her career is truly remarkable. From serving as a lawyer for the United Nations in Kosovo, Gaza, Lebanon, and New York, to her tenure as a member of the Australian Parliament and former Minister for International Development. In 2017, she was appointed as an ambassador for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the ICAN. That same year, the campaign was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for achieving the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. More recently, Ms. Parke has also served as a member of the UN Group of Eminent Experts on Yemen during the conflict from 2017 to 2021. Currently, Ms. Parke is the Executive Director of the ICAN, a position she's held since September 2023. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to the Honorable Melissa Parke.
In the face of the clear refusal of nuclear-armed states to disarm in accordance with their legal obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Just 10 years later, ICAN had become a civil society movement made up of hundreds of partner organisations and won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work highlighting the devastating humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and for its work in getting a new UN treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons adopted at the UN General Assembly. I'll come back to the treaty a little later. I served for 9 years as an Australian Member of Parliament, including time as Minister for International Development. As an MP, I focused very much on international affairs, disarmament, human rights and the environment. I was deeply inspired by the example of Tom Uren, a former Australian government minister who had been a prisoner of war in Japan during the Second World War. He witnessed the bombing of Nagasaki and was forever changed by that experience. When he came home, he spent the rest of his life, including as an MP and minister, campaigning for peace and nuclear disarmament. He understood that nuclear weapons are not an abstract, distant threat, but instead present an existential danger to all life on Earth. He said the struggle against nuclear weapons is the most important struggle for the human race. After retiring from Parliament, I became an ICAN Australia ambassador and, as you heard, more recently appointed as the Executive Director of ICAN International. But in Australia, we recently commemorated the 70th anniversary of British nuclear weapons testing, which disproportionately affected Aboriginal Australians, who were the primary victims, along with veterans. Many of the survivors and their children continue to suffer debilitating health issues, and they're still waiting for compensation and for environmental remediation of their lands. Indigenous peoples of the world have always understood the connection between all things, people, animals, and all of nature, and that there is a natural balance that must be respected. And I'm convinced that most of the problems facing the world today, pandemics, climate change, mass extinctions, nuclear weapons, mental health crises, and even war, stem from humanity's disconnection, our sense of separation from nature and from each other, from forgetting that we on this planet are all ultimately connected. And our way back rests in rediscovering that truth. Prior to being elected to Parliament in Australia, I was an international lawyer with the United Nations in places like Kosovo, Gaza, Lebanon, and Yemen, where I saw firsthand the impact of war on civilians. I spent 2.5 years in Gaza, and one of my most powerful memories from that time was attending a Hiroshima and Nagasaki commemoration ceremony in August 2002 at the Gaza harbour. Hundreds of Palestinian children had made little paper boats with candles in them. They carefully lit the candles and set the boats afloat on Gaza harbour. It was extraordinarily beautiful, but also very moving to think that here were children who were themselves experiencing bombing on a regular basis, remembering children from another time and another place who'd been bombed. And of course, this has particular resonance for me right now. And just last week, I visited Japan as I met the survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as the hibakusha, who had been children at the time of the bombings. I was struck by the realization that these were the same children now in their 80s and 90s who were being remembered by the children of Gaza 22 years ago. And while I was in Tokyo, I visited the Daigo Fukuryu Maru Museum and learned the story of the Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon that had been a few hundred kilometres from Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific when the US exploded its biggest ever nuclear weapon test, known as Castle Bravo, on the 1st of March 1954. It was 1,000 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The fishermen were all exposed to radioactive fallout and almost immediately started experiencing symptoms of radiation sickness, although they didn't know that's what it was at the time. Upon their return to Yaiko port in Japan 2 weeks later, the fishermen were hospitalised. The issue became national and worldwide news, especially when the ship's radio operator, aged 40, died a few months later in September 1954, saying he hoped he would be the last to die because of nuclear weapons. The rain that fell in Japan months after the test was found to be contaminated with radiation. Local Japanese women took up a consumer campaign to raise awareness about contaminated tuna that they did not want to feed to their children. The evidence of contamination of fish and places thousands of miles from the test site, and evidence that emerged over the decades about the experiences of other nuclear weapons test victims from the Pacific, Australia, North America, Algeria, Tibet, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and as I understand it, North Korea. We're getting some evidence on that shortly, has led to the global realization that nuclear weapons are uniquely destructive over space and time. The fishing vessel incident was so significant because it led to scientific and public understanding about the radiation effects of nuclear weapons and a new appreciation in Japan and the world about what the Hiroshima and Nagasaki hibakusha had experienced and why nuclear weapons were particularly insidious and dangerous. The hibakusha in Japan, in those who'd suffered from the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they experienced discrimination for a long time because right up until this time, so that's like 9 years after they'd experienced the bombing, they experienced a lot of discrimination because they were suffering all of these illnesses and cancers, and people didn't realise that it was a result of radiation poisoning. They just thought they had some horrible contagious diseases in those cities. So they were discriminated against, they were ostracised, stigmatised. And it wasn't until this fishing vessel incident became so prominent that everybody realised that this is what the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were suffering from. And as a result, there was a lot more understanding and empathy for them. It was learning about the fishing vessel incident that led to Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein issuing their manifesto in 1955, the last thing Einstein did before he died, in which they highlighted the dangers posed by nuclear weapons and called for world leaders to seek peaceful resolutions to international conflict. Russell and Einstein noted that the people who knew the most about nuclear weapons were the most gloomy, and they insisted, we have to learn to think in a new way. We have to learn to ask ourselves not what steps can be taken to give military victory to whatever group we prefer, for there are no longer such steps. The question we have to ask ourselves is what steps can be taken to prevent a military contest which must be disastrous to all parties. The risk of nuclear war is at its highest now since the Cold War. There are currently two major conflicts involving nuclear-armed states. There are renewed nuclear threats in the context of both of those conflicts, a breakdown in arms control agreements, and a new nuclear arms race underway. Nuclear weapons now are many times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed more than 250,000 people, and which today would be considered small tactical nuclear weapons. Once again, new thinking is needed. In July last year, the UN Secretary General issued his new agenda for peace, in which the #1 recommendation was the elimination of nuclear weapons. Last August, more than 150 medical journals from around the world, including The Lancet, issued a joint call for urgent action to eliminate nuclear weapons as a public health priority. They referenced the study published in Nature journal in 2022, which concluded that even a limited nuclear war, say between India and Pakistan, would kill 120 million people outright and cause global climate disruption through soot being ejected into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing mass crop failure, putting the lives of 2 billion people at risk from starvation within 2 years. A major nuclear war between the US and Russia would kill upwards of 5 billion people, which would be the end of human civilization as we know it, as well as most other life forms. Given that nuclear weapons are an existential threat to the survival of humankind, they should not be dealt with as a national security prerogative of a select few states. In a joint statement in 2022, the UN Security Council permanent members, all of whom are nuclear-armed states, agreed that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. So they themselves know that nuclear weapons are not just genocidal, but also suicidal. The only way to ensure nuclear weapons will never be used again is through total disarmament. Yet nuclear-armed states hold internally contradictory positions. They all have policies supporting nuclear disarmament and a nuclear weapons-free world, while at the same time maintaining that their possession of nuclear weapons is essential for global stability and keeps us safe. We see in the context of the Ukraine war that rather than providing peace and stability, nuclear weapons have been used to coerce and intimidate. We're seeing the rapid escalation of nuclear risk on the Korean Peninsula, and a number of countries starting to speculate publicly about potentially acquiring nuclear weapons themselves, including South Korea and Saudi Arabia. The fact is, as former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, there are no right hands for wrong weapons. The more that nuclear-armed states and their allies insist that nuclear weapons are essential for their security, the more other countries will want them, thus encouraging proliferation. The narrow, self-serving, short-sighted conception of national security of nuclear-armed states and their allies, which is based on the flawed theory of nuclear deterrence, endangers the collective security of all of humanity. Nuclear deterrence is based on the willingness and readiness to wage nuclear war, which would kill millions of innocent people outright and lead to a nuclear winter and mass starvation. Deterrence is also deeply flawed, since it assumes 100% rationality and predictability by all actors, including one's enemies, 100% of the time. It's a pretty bold assumption to make. There are many things also that can't be deterred, such as accidents, miscalculations, unhinged leaders, terrorist groups, cyber attacks, and simple mistakes. The large number of weapons on high alert launch status, the combining of nuclear and conventional weapons command systems, and the increasing use of artificial intelligence in the military makes accidents and mistakes all the more likely. The fact we haven't had nuclear weapons used in 75 years is not as a result of system integrity or infallibility or the inherent stability of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. It has been sheer dumb luck, and it is utterly fanciful to think that that luck will continue indefinitely, since there have been many accidents and nuclear near misses over the decades. The question is, do we want to continue to rely on luck for the future, or take action to eliminate the risk, which is growing every day? As the UN Secretary General recently said, luck is not a strategy. Since this is an economic summit, I thought I'd mention the issue of risk management. Many of you will be familiar with the concept of a risk assessment matrix, which is based on two intersecting factors: the likelihood or probability a risk event will occur and the potential impact or consequences the risk event will have. When you combine what deterrence advocates may call a low likelihood event of the use of nuclear weapons with what would undeniably be catastrophic consequences, you end up with a high risk that has to be managed. And based on the more than 60 past accidental and nuclear near-miss events that we know about, likely have been many more that we don't know about, scientists and mathematicians have established the annual probability of nuclear weapons being used, for example, through a mistaken belief by either the United States or Russia that the other has launched a nuclear attack, as 1% per year. 1 in 100. Now, would you get on a plane if you knew that it had a 1 in 100 chance of crashing? I wouldn't. If you bought a lottery ticket and were told that you had a 1 in 100 chance of winning it, you'd think that was pretty good odds. So, and that 1%, according to the law of probability, is not static. It rises, it keeps rising every year that it hasn't happened. And so when you're talking about civilization-ending weapons, any risk above zero is unacceptable. Putting it simply, eliminating nuclear weapons is good risk management. It's also imperative legally and morally. There is no use of nuclear weapons that can be consistent with international law, given the indiscriminate and disproportionate killing of civilians and the destruction of the environment involved. Morally, you don't need to look any further than Hiroshima and Nagasaki or any of the places where these weapons have been tested to know the right thing to do. Who's heard of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists? The Doomsday Clock? Just very few of you. The Doomsday Clock, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and the Doomsday Clock were established by Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer and other nuclear scientists in 1947 to indicate where humanity sits in relation to, like, the end of humanity, like looking at all the risks that the world faces. And they use the clock, with midnight being Armageddon, essentially. And this year and last year, the scientists who make this pronouncement every year have set the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight, based on the twin existential threats of nuclear weapons and the environment crisis, as well as emerging issues like artificial intelligence. It was very significant that they linked these threats. I think it's critical that we break down the silos where only so-called defence or security experts get to talk about nuclear weapons, and recognise that nuclear weapons are everyone's business. Nuclear weapons are not separate from other global concerns. They are deeply interconnected. Nuclear weapons worsen environmental problems, divert essential funds away from addressing pressing global challenges like climate change and social inequality, and undermine the principles of human rights and justice. Can there be a greater infringement of human rights than nuclear weapons, which impact the right to life, the right to health, the right to a clean environment, and so on? The International Committee of the Red Cross has always maintained that there can be no effective health or humanitarian response to a nuclear war, since all the road, hospital and communications infrastructure would be destroyed and most health and emergency workers would be either dead or incapacitated. And let me just add, since we're at an economic summit, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, a nuclear war would be catastrophic for the economy. The 9 nuclear weapon states do not have the right to threaten by their possession of nuclear weapons not just genocide, but omnicide, the destruction of all life on Earth. This is because we're talking about not just the incineration of millions of innocent civilians, their loved ones, their homes, their cities, lands, rivers, and climate, and the long-term radioactive contamination of those places, but also the prospect of the nuclear winter. Biodiversity is under extreme threat, with 70% of decline in animal species in the last 50 years, according to WWF. A nuclear winter would cause the sixth mass extinction to come even sooner. And in addition to nuclear winter, there are further connections between nuclear weapons and the other two existential threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. Nuclear weapons production and testing damage the environment and increase emissions, exacerbating the climate crisis. At the same time, the increase in extreme weather events and rising sea levels caused by the climate crisis accelerates the risks of radioactive contamination from nuclear weapons activities. Nuclear war will become more likely due to a climate crisis-driven rise of resource scarcity and conflict. Nuclear war would have a devastating impact on all living things. This is why Japanese research last year, Professor Kunio Kaiho from Tohoku University, concluded that the priority for animal species conservation must be 1, to prevent nuclear war, 2, decrease deforestation rates, 3, reduce pollution, and 4, limit global warming in that order. The research highlights the fact that while every species will be harmed in a nuclear war, only one species can stop it. Thus, the abolition of nuclear weapons is an essential part of respecting and protecting the planet, the climate, humanity, and all living things. There can be no nuclear weapons on a sustainable planet. But rather than disarmament, which the nuclear armed states, including the United Kingdom, are legally obligated to do under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we're seeing them modernising and expanding their nuclear arsenals at a cost of $83 billion last year. This expenditure comes at the cost of investment in genuine human security, such as disarmament, development, diplomacy, and environmental protection. As during the Cold War, humanity is now at a critical decision point to go down the path of increased militarisation, confrontation, and nuclear proliferation, a downward spiral that can only end in nuclear annihilation, or global cooperation and dialogue to address the multiple challenges facing the world. Around half the countries of the world have already made the decision to cooperate in the interests of collective security and common humanity through joining the new UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which provides a legal and verifiable pathway to the elimination of nuclear weapons. More countries, including big countries like Indonesia and Brazil, are expected to ratify the treaty soon. The treaty is a game changer. It is an investment into multilateralism and international law at a time when those mechanisms to examine and ensure global cooperation and legal frameworks are increasingly under pressure. The treaty is rooted in the moral, legal, and humanitarian imperative to ban these weapons of mass destruction rather than the dangerous theory of deterrence. Though the TPNW is still a new treaty, it has so far been boycotted by the nuclear armed states and their allies. It has already had an impressive impact. It has brought humanitarian and environmental concerns to the fore of the debate about nuclear weapons through listening to science and the testimony of survivors. It has also reinvigorated efforts to achieve nuclear justice in countries still suffering from the long-term consequences of nuclear tests conducted decades ago. The treaty is supported by hundreds of major cities around the world because cities, of course, are the primary targets of nuclear weapons. New York and Paris are among those cities that support the treaty. The treaty has also prompted local governments, pension funds, banks, and other financial institutions to divest billions of dollars from the companies that manufacture nuclear weapons because they are now banned. It has solidified the international consensus that nuclear threats, whether explicit or implicit, are inadmissible. And the treaty has exposed the dangerous fallacy of nuclear deterrence. Never before has a UN treaty laid out the threat that nuclear deterrence poses to the future of life on our planet. So as ICAN, our focus now is on getting as many countries as possible to join the treaty with the aim of prohibiting, stigmatising and eliminating nuclear weapons based on earlier successful campaigns around landmines and cluster munitions. Incidentally, climate campaigners have taken inspiration from ICAN's global campaign on the TPNW to start a global campaign for a new treaty on fossil fuels. Rather than waiting for nuclear weapon states and fossil fuel addicted countries to take action, other nations, many of them from the global south, are taking power into their own hands with help of civil society, scientists, academics, and affected communities. This is the leadership that is needed to deal with the multiple existential crises facing the planet. These crises are interconnected and must be tackled simultaneously. Though I note that nuclear war may be seen as climate change and species extinction at supersonic speed. And you could say that while climate change and biodiversity loss are eroding our chances every day, nuclear weapons can end them in an instant. The abolition of nuclear weapons is arguably the least complex of the crises. Nuclear weapons were built by humans, and they can be and have been already in the past dismantled by humans. All that is needed to do this is political will. And this would, in addition to preventing potential nuclear Armageddon, have the benefit of assisting with the other global crises. As US author Timon Wallace points out in his book, Warheads to Windmills, we can't do much about the climate while the biggest carbon emitting countries are pointing nuclear warheads at each other. Eliminating nuclear weapons would bring about the increased global cooperation that is needed to deal with the other global challenges. It would significantly reduce carbon emissions and other environmental damage from nuclear weapons development and testing. It would free up thousands of STEM graduates, scientists and researchers currently working in the nuclear weapons industries, and release billions of dollars to deal with the climate change and biodiversity crisis. The biggest carbon emitters are also the major nuclear powers. Both on climate and nuclear weapons, there are powerful industries spending vast amounts of money on lobbying and political donations, leading to vested interests and government capture. But we've got something even more powerful on our side, people power. We recognise the incredible power of civil society in shaping history. Anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a small group of concerned citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Civil society movements have a long history of driving meaningful change, and today ICAN stands as a shining example of what global collective action can achieve. We would love the peace and environmental movements to be even stronger by combining our efforts and thinking about the issues holistically. What is our vision for the planet? What does a sustainable planet look like? It certainly doesn't have nuclear weapons on it, and it requires strong and urgent action on climate and species extinction. It's about creating the necessary public pressure on governments and industries to bring about change. There is a current lack of public awareness about the imminent danger of nuclear weapons. There was a lot of awareness about it in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up, but that seems to have dissipated, even though the actual danger that exists from nuclear weapons is even greater now than it was then. But we need to take every opportunity to broaden our message and our audiences, and to influence more people to take the message into the community, whether that be students, scientists, trade unions, consumers, businesses, animal lovers, artists, local governments, financial institutions, health and educational institutions. We're encouraging UN agencies like the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Environment Programme, the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Programme, UN Development Programme, and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs to include discussion of nuclear weapons in their policies and agendas, rather than just at present, the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs. We especially need more young people to get involved and active. You, bring fresh perspectives, innovative ideas, and boundless energy to our campaign. Taking action is the antidote to becoming despondent about the state of the world. As the American activist for civil and children's rights, Marian Wright Edelman, said, "It is so important not to become apathetic or cynical by telling ourselves that nothing works or makes a difference. Every day, light your small candle." We owe it to the past, as well as our future, to be involved in some way to save humanity and the planet. We all, each of us in our own way, can light our small candle. As ICAN's example shows, from little things, big things grow. Thank you.
Into leading organizations for peace, especially the danger of nuclear weapons, which is particularly relevant in this world of uncertainties and conflict resolution in the context of the nuclear. Before starting our Q&A session, I'd like to remind you, please, to wait for the microphone to be passed to you before speaking, and keep your questions short and to the point. So let's start a Q&A. We'll take a question from this person in the middle section, please, right in the front.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. My name is Gonzalo from the University of Warwick, and you mentioned how we need to deter states, obviously, from using nuclear weapons. But I want to know your opinion in knowing how to deter maybe non-state actors, maybe terrorist groups, from getting their hands on this kind of technology, maybe through the black market or illicit networks like the CAN network exposed in 2004.
There's been some research around this, which has shown that it's actually not that easy it's not that easy to develop nuclear weapons. It needs a lot of infrastructure and equipment and so forth. And so the most likely way for a terrorist group to receive a nuclear weapon is to receive either complete warheads or components from existing nuclear armed states. And, you know, there are a number of nuclear armed states who could potentially be interested in selling things. And so, in fact, the best thing we could do to reduce the risk of terrorists getting hold of nuclear weapons is to eliminate nuclear weapons. Because the more people, the more states that have them, the more avenues there are for terrorists to get hold of them.
Thank you. We'll take another question in the upper tier, please, in the middle. The person there.
Hi, my name is Amy Rogers. I'm a student with Sciences Po in the University of Sydney. So you spoke a lot about how the two biggest challenges that we're facing today are nuclear weapons and the climate crisis. And I was wondering what your perspective on the development of nuclear power as a sustainable energy solution would be. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. ICAN, because in terms of the treaty, we have states parties that are on both sides of this issue. So we don't take I guess, an official position when it comes to the treaty about nuclear power. But personally, I've seen a lot of evidence of the damage that is done through the whole nuclear cycle process, whether that's from uranium mining, the health impacts on surrounding communities and employees of uranium mining, or whether it's the nuclear waste disposal. I was in the Meet the Speaker panel earlier, and we were talking about the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington State in the United States, which has been described as the most toxic place in America and possibly the world. And it's where the nuclear waste has been dumped for a long time, high-level radioactive nuclear waste. And it's being stored in, there's 155 million gallons of this waste being stored in 177 steel containers underground that were only built to last for a couple of decades. I guess they thought they'd find a solution within that time. They haven't found a solution. those tanks are leaking now into the nearby Columbia River. There's been devastating health consequences for local community in the area and employees of the Hanford Reservation and local Indigenous peoples as well. And the bill for the cleanup now stands at $677 billion, and they still don't have a solution. It's insane. And everywhere you have nuclear reactors, you have a problem of how you're going to deal with the waste. And this is waste that has to be stored safely for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's been no solution found to it. And it is totally irresponsible to be producing more of this waste when you don't know where it's going to go and where it can be put safely. And so that's, and of course, the other point to make is that the production of nuclear weapons in many cases has started from a nuclear energy industry. So so whether it's India and Pakistan or Israel and North Korea, they all had nuclear power industries. And because it's exactly the same process and the same materials, you just enrich the uranium even further. And that's how you get to nuclear weapons materials. It's very easy and it's very, it's a dangerous slippery slope basically. And that's why we don't encourage it. We don't, and in addition to the fact that it's way more expensive than other forms of electricity generation, that it has to be heavily subsidised wherever it is. So it's not the solution that people say it is. And I know there's a lot of industries promoting it, but it is simply not the solution. And I think renewable energy is the way to go.
Thank you. We'll take a question on the right, please, in the upper tier, the very first row. Yeah, the guy raising them. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Paul, UPF. I agree morally on a moral standpoint with you, but at the same time, I also think that one of the reasons that for the past 70 years we haven't had any direct conflict between world powers, or simply put, that the Cold War didn't develop into a third world war, is the nuclear deterrent, and I'd like to know what's your opinion on that.
There's no evidence that nuclear weapons have deterred a war, a third world war, apart from the mere correlation of the existence of the weapons and the fact that a third world war hasn't occurred yet. There's been lots of war that has occurred. There's a lot of war going on right now involving nuclear armed states. It clearly hasn't been a deterrent to states entering into war or having other parties, whether they be states or non-state actors, taking on war against them. And there are a lot of reasons why a country may not want to go to war that are not connected to nuclear weapons. It will have a devastating impact on the economy. There's been growth in international cooperation and multilateral agreements and bilateral agreements. There's a big cost in terms of blood and treasure in going to war. And that also can be a reason why there hasn't been a third world war or a war between major powers at this point in time.
I mean, if we look at the Ukraine-Russia conflict, Russia has nuclear weapons and UK threatens Russia to use their weapons, and Russia provides a plan of how they would destroy the whole UK island. So, and still there is a war between Ukraine and Russia, right? Now, if you allow me, I'll ask a personal question. That's like my joker in the summit. So you mentioned Oppenheimer, the inventor of the atomic bomb. And I'm sure you're all aware in the audience and yourself about the movie that took place, I think this summer, right? And it provided such a big momentum. Everyone witnessed the creation of this bomb, with Oppenheimer saying when this bomb happened, now I am become death, the destroyer of words.
Yeah.
Do you think that this movie, especially coming from a very famous producer, Christopher Nolan, who has like a very big platform, has provided the ICAN with a wider audience to spread their message and become even more relevant now.
Yeah, it definitely has done that. I think, and it's not only done that, but it's prompting other movie directors to take on projects involving nuclear weapons that we'll see over the next couple of years. There's more and more movies coming out. It was a really brilliant movie, Oppenheimer. I enjoyed it very much as a kind of biopic about one man. And it did raise awareness about the nuclear weapons, the general sense of danger, but it did not, unfortunately, I think, feature, any of the consequences of nuclear weapons use. It was only implied. And I think there are so many impacts from nuclear weapons use and nuclear weapons testing, like at Los Alamos, that that could have been very easily been part of the movie, and it would have had even greater, I think, educational impact and awareness raising impact. But I think it was a great movie for itself, and it did raise awareness, and yeah, we're grateful that it was done. And it's interesting that the scientists who know the most about nuclear weapons became the most ardent advocates against them. Joseph Rotblat was one of the early nuclear scientists working on the Manhattan Project, and he was the one who left for moral reasons. And he then campaigned against nuclear weapons, was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his campaign, and he described the theory of nuclear deterrence as the ultimate form of terrorism. These are guys who know what they're talking about. We should be listening to them.
Especially Oppenheimer, he refused to carry on with the project to make a bigger bomb, right? We'll now take one last question. So, please, the person in the upper tier, in the middle.
So essentially, I was wondering, how do you propose convincing countries like North Korea to disarm their nuclear weapons?
Well, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is egalitarian and non-discriminatory. So basically, we aim to prohibit the weapons from all countries. And as I mentioned earlier, there are no right hands for wrong weapons. So yes, North Korea has nuclear weapons, but we're also interested in the other nuclear armed states disarming as well. It's interesting that each of the nuclear armed states justifies their possession of nuclear weapons by reference to the other's possession of nuclear weapons. So it's a very circular argument. And there's got to be some leadership at some point, as there was during the Cold War when General Secretary Gorbachev and President Reagan sat down at the height of the Cold War when there were 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world and almost agreed to eliminate them entirely. Sadly, that didn't happen, but they did massively reduce the number. Now there are 12,500 nuclear weapons. That's a big decrease. It's still 12,500 too many, but it just shows that with political leadership, it can happen, and that's what we need to see. We need to see a turning away. In North Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, we're seeing escalations from both sides. We're seeing North Korea testing missiles, and we're seeing the US and South Korea getting together and on nuclear planning exercises and shows of force involving big aircraft carriers and submarines and nuclear armed planes as a kind of, as a counter to what North Korea is doing. And all of that's doing is ratcheting up the tension and the pressure when we need to be talking about dialogue, getting countries together and working out what are the mutual security guarantees that need to be made so that countries can feel comfortable that there are stringent verification processes in place, that they can disarm, knowing that other countries are also disarming. I mean, it's not going to be a fast, quick process, but it needs to happen. We need that global cooperation, and it's not pie in the sky. It's been done before. It just requires some leadership. And in the absence of political leadership, which is essentially what we're seeing in the globe right now, that's when public pressure becomes so important. And that's where all of us come in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Parke, for your presence. And I hope that your message carries on with our own audience, whether in person or online, because we have lots of people watching online too. And yeah, thank you, dear audience, for your questions and for your continuous engagement.